Hey everyone, in this video we're going to learn about nested loops. Now in the last video we learned about for loops. If we add one for loop inside the other, it's known as a nested loop. Let's take a look at the code we were working on in the previous video. The link for the same is in the description below. So in this part of the program, we essentially used a for loop where the variable x was increasing from 25 to 400 in steps of 50, and by doing so we were able to draw 8 ellipses or rectangles in various positions by calling those functions only once. But what do we do if we want an ellipse all over the canvas in the x and the y direction? Now this is where nested loops come into play. Essentially, we would write one for loop inside another. Now over here, if you look in the first for loop, we are increasing the value of x from 25 to 400 in increments of 50. What if we did the same for the y direction as well? So if we were to put that inside the x loop, that would mean every time x is 25, so every time the x cursor is here, one entire y loop would run. So that would populate this entire column. And only then would it switch to the next x value. So let's try that. I'm going to create a variable called y over here. And inside this for loop, make sure that it's inside the existing for loop. We're going to say for y equal to 25, y less than 400, since the height of the canvas was also 400, y equals y plus 50. And let's just tab this so it looks cleaner. So essentially what's happening is in the draw loop we enter into this for loop first, where x has the initial value of 25. From there we enter this for loop where y is 25, and whatever is inside the innermost for loop runs 8 times while x is 25. Then what happens is it exits that loop, goes back to the x loop where x now becomes 75, and then it runs this entire y for loop for x equals 75, which means the second column is populated. So ideally when we run this, we should get the entire grid populated. But to do that, we also need to change this value over here. Now y is changing from 25 to 400, but we haven't actually used it anywhere. So we'll just say y over here inside ellipse and rectangle. And there we have it. We managed to populate an entire grid. That is, we've managed to now actually go from 8 to 64 shapes by just adding another for loop. So go over the concept of for loops once again, especially nested. What we do in programming is we do something called a dry run to understand these concepts. That means we actually write down and we say, okay, the first time we enter the for loop, the value of x is 25, the value of y is 25, and this is drawn at 25, 25. Then it exits the first loop, x is still 25, but now y is 75, and we actually write it down and draw it. This practice is very helpful in understanding what actually happens within each loop. So definitely try that out and play around with nested for loops, because there's so much more that you can suddenly do by just using a for loop. Thank you and see you in the next video.